Do you love the classic design and aesthetics of a traditional pocket knife, but appreciate the practicality of a one-hand opening and locking knife? Or maybe you're looking for a dressed-up knife that you can take to those fancier occasions, but still use if you really need to? Well, then this video might be for you, because this Knife Thoughts video is on the Jack Wolf Knives Gunslinger. So what is the Jack Wolf Knives Gunslinger? So this is the first one-hand opening and first locking knife from Jack Wolf Knives. And Jack Wolf Knives is a relatively newer company that has been making a lot of modern traditionals or modern slip joint knives. You can see their motto here is modern interpretation, timeless design. And the owner, Ben Belkin, and designer, has done a really great job of bringing classic traditional slip joint patterns into the modern era with more modern construction and materials. And if you haven't seen any of my videos on Jack Wolf Knives, definitely go check them out. I have a full playlist and I've had the great pleasure of getting to check out and review all of the models so far. But all of those models so far have been slip joints. So they've had a back spring and are two-hand opening and non-locking. And now I love slip joints. It's actually kind of my main passion in knives is slip joint knives, and especially traditional slip joint knives. So I've really enjoyed getting to check these out. But the really interesting thing about these slip joints is that Ben does such a great job of taking these traditional patterns and making them a little bit more modern. I really enjoy getting to see how he does that for each of these patterns. And so when I heard that he was bringing out a one-hand opening locking knife, it was a surprise to me, but a very welcome surprise, because knowing how well he has done with modernizing these slip joints, I thought he probably was going to do a great job of taking one step further and bringing a traditional pattern into the world of one-hand opening and locking knives. And so the first slip joint that Jack Wolf Knives came out with was the sharpshooter. And so this is a gunstock jack. And if you are interested in the pattern and the history of the pattern, definitely go check out my video on the sharpshooter where I talk more about that. But the Gunslinger is also a gunstock. So this is a gunstock pattern, just with those features of a modern one-hand opening and locking knife. And just like on the sharpshooter, I think that the handle shape, the pattern itself, the actual shape of the knife is super, super classic traditional gun stock. I mean, it looks like the stock of a gun. It has the classic shape of traditional gun stock pattern knives. And the clip point is really beautifully done. I mean, I think that Ben does a great job of clip points overall. Here is another clip point, the Benny's clip, and then here is the sharpshooter jack clip point. So you can see that they're relatively similar between the Gunslinger and the sharpshooter. But it just is really a well done and very classic looking gunstock knife. So if you saw this knife from this angle right here like this, I think that you could be fooled into thinking that this was a slip joint. It's only when you turn it and you see that lock and then the clip on the other side that you realize that it is a modern one-hand opening knife. And so, like I said in the intro there, that's really one of the huge things about this knife that I really appreciate. And that is that it's not just, kind of a little bit inspired by a traditional pattern. It really looks like a traditional gunstock, but still has those very functional features of one-hand opening and locking. And I'll talk more about the action, the opening and locking itself later. But I really like that because, again, to me, I love the traditional aesthetic of something like this Great Eastern Cutlery gunstock. So you can see very, very similar. Of course, the Gunslinger is bigger, but the same idea. It has that same handle shape, the same clip point style blade. Now, of course, this is a two-bladed knife, but there are certainly single-bladed traditional gunstock knives also. But it has that same look to it while having those modern features. So I really appreciate that, because for me, I carry these traditional knives because I enjoy the aesthetic. I enjoy the design, the aesthetic, the timeless look, the historicity of them. But at the same time, I pretty much always carry a modern knife also because I appreciate the practicality of it. You know, these knives, you have to open them with two hands. They're non-locking, so you have to be a little bit more careful. And usually you have to close them with two hands also. So the Gunslinger really has the look, the true look of a traditional knife, but with those modern features. And of course, there are some other designers out there that have done similar things. Notable example is Pena knives. There are, models like the Pena Barlow, which is also a front flipper with a locking blade, and then, trapper and things like that. But I think that this Gunslinger really does, takes it a little bit further in looking like the traditional pattern. The other thing that I would compare with those, I don't actually have a Pena to directly show you a comparison, but a difference is the style of front flipper. So I'll talk more about that later. But the other thing that I think that this knife does really well from a design and material standpoint is being dressy. So like I said in the intro again, this knife is a really great choice if you are looking for a knife that you can take to a fancier occasion, that you can take out of your pocket, and really, it feels as much like a piece of jewelry as it does a tool. You have this beautiful, beautiful fat carbon dark matter gold, which is just absolutely incredible. I don't think that it's showing in the camera as really incredible looking as it is in person. When I showed this to people, several people thought that it was real gold, and several people were just really kind of mesmerized by the look of that carbon fiber shredded with the gold colored material in there. And I just think it looks really classy. Now, there are other options of handle, materials, covers that are not this gold, but honestly, I am super happy that this is the one that Ben sent me, because I think that it really exemplifies that classiness. And Ben, actually, I got a chance to sit and talk with Ben at the Great Eastern Cutlery Rendezvous this past weekend, and he pointed out that that was one of the things that he was trying to do with these, is make them, crank it up to 11, really make them fancy, dressy, really pull out all the stops. And I think that this gold carbon fiber really does that. It really looks beautiful. And all of these except one have a matching color clip. One of them has an opposite color clip, but mine here has a matching anodized titanium clip, which really goes well. And then you can see it has a matching anodized backspacer, which also really goes well, and goes the full length of the handle. That's another thing that's different. Really makes it look classy. You have that full backspacer there to make it look, again, more like the traditional pattern. So like a traditional gun stock where it has the full length spring, the Gunslinger doesn't have a spring, but it does have the full length backspacer. So I really think that Ben did a great job of making these very dressy, but still be practical using knives. So let's move into talking about that, about the actual use and function of this knife. So this is a front flipper. You can see the tab here, but I would actually call it it is a front flipper, but it has other options to open it too. So you can see that this has a long pull. And so if you initially looked at that, you might think that's just for opening it two-handed, but it actually works both for a middle finger flick really, really well. It's actually really easy to flick it with the middle finger there, and also for a classic slow roll thumb opening. So really easy to open this blade. I got to check this out at Blade Show before I got mine, and I was really impressed by how easy it is to open, particularly with that long pull. Sometimes slot opening methods don't work super well for me, but this one works really, really well. And I think that it's because the edges are so crisply ground on that. You can really catch on that with your thumb and or middle finger. So it works really well. But the front flipper also works really well for me. Now, for a long time, I didn't like front flippers. I had trouble with them, and I think a big part of the reason for that is because I was really using more of what I would call a top flipper. And so I talked about the Pena front flippers previously, and that's what I would call those, is they don't have this type of kind of post or right angle front flipper that's really in the front here of the pivot, but more so a kind of jimped area on the top that I would call maybe a top flipper. And it can work a little bit differently. Sometimes you can do that one with your index finger a little bit better, but I have trouble opening that type of front flipper with my thumb. And actually, the knife that kind of converted me to front flippers, the Civivi Sikoke, has this type of true front flipper where it has kind of a right angled post in the front. Now the Sikoke has a really, really big front flipper, but it's the same type of thing here on the Gunslinger, and it works really well for me. And in fact, I was impressed. I got to show this to quite a few people actually since getting it. And people who like knives but aren't necessarily enthusiasts and really had never seen a front flipper. And pretty much everybody was able to get it relatively quickly. Now, of course, you know, they'd fumble and get it partway open because it hits their hand or something, but it's pretty intuitive, I would say. And I certainly have no trouble with it. It works really, really well. You can open it very snappily, and the detent is great on this. Just feels really, really crisp, but not so strong that it's difficult to open. And speaking of being difficult to open, the other thing that I really like about this is that it is a bolster lock. So this is not necessarily a frame lock where you would have the whole frame exposed. And the difficulty with that for me is that I often, with my kind of wide fingers, put pressure on the frame lock, on the lock bar itself. And that makes it difficult to open because it pushes the detent ball down into the blade. Because this has the full length cover on the lock side, you really can't do that. You're going to be pressing on the cover rather than on the lock. So I have never had any issue with, you know, pushing on this and making it difficult to open. And speaking of the lock, it is done really well. So you can see that it does have a lock bar insert that functions as an over travel stop. And mine locks up really nicely, maybe 30, maybe 40%, something like that. It's locked up perfectly every time, no issues at all. Now, another thing Ben said is that he went through a lot of different prototypes on these, making sure to get them correctly. And one thing is that he was getting a kind of a pinch with his thumb there. Now, I will say that at first I felt that a little bit, but it went away. So I don't know if it was something where I just got used to how, you know, to unlock it, but I have no issue unlocking it either. You can see that it drops closed really, really nicely. It's extremely smooth. And for being a relatively thin knife with a, you know, relatively small cutout there, you can see it does have cutouts on either side of the handle to help you, you know, give you a little bit more space to get your thumb in. But again, with these kind of thick thumbs, even, you know, being a relatively small area to get my thumb into, I don't have any trouble unlocking it. You can see I can get in there really easily, unlock it, and it drops closed. So the lock, the opening, they work really, really well. I'm really impressed by it. And then the cutting. Now, if you, again, have seen any of my videos on Jack Wolf knives, you know that I'm always impressed with the cutting. They do a really incredible job of slicing because they have these great, thin, tall grinds. And that's very true also for this Gunslinger. It cuts really, really well. I actually got to use this relatively heavily. I used it for cutting some hot dog sticks, and the branches that I was being given were a little bit big, so I had to cut some relatively big offshoots off, and it did great. Used this for normal cutting boxes, some food prep, things like that while I was traveling, and it really, really does well. I'm really impressed by the grinds that are on these Jack Wolf knives. Speaking of that, it's S90V, and I wasn't really too familiar with S90V until Jack Wolf Knives started using it, and I have been impressed with it also. I didn't have any chipping cutting those hot dog sticks. Like I said, relatively thick pieces of wood that I was cutting off, or offshoots, and didn't have any trouble with chipping, and honestly it hasn't needed to be sharpened. Even using it on plates sometimes, like ceramic plates, it doesn't seem to have dulled much at all. So really impressed with that. And that really, you know, all exemplifies what I said about this knife in the introduction, which is it is a very traditional looking pattern, but has all of the function of a modern knife. So I want to show you again a comparison between the Gunslinger and the Sharpshooter. You can see the Gunslinger is quite a bit bigger. That's another thing, is this is a full-sized EDC knife. Here is the Gunslinger with the GEC 44 gun stock. But the Gunslinger is a full-sized EDC knife. It's not a massive knife. I often will carry a larger modern knife than this, but it is definitely a good-sized EDC knife. So I'll give you a comparison to a modern EDC classic, the Civivi Elementum, and you can see that the Gunslinger is actually a little bigger. It's a little longer, so you get a little bit more blade out of the Gunslinger and a little bit more handle. So this is a knife that you could really carry and really use. You know, use this as your main EDC, your main cutting tool, and I think that it would do great, but it would also look really good while it was doing it. So you'd get that traditional aesthetic, but have the practicality of a modern knife, and have a really dressy looking knife that you can use and not worry about not having enough knife. So I am really genuinely impressed by this Gunslinger. I have loved carrying it, and if you do, you know, I've carried it with the clip, but if you don't want to use the clip, it does come with a little filler tab that goes where the clip is. So, you know, that's a good option. It doesn't come with a slip like other Jack Wolf knives have, but I think most people are going to carry this with the clip because that adds that modern knife practicality. So I have really loved getting to carry and use this knife, and I can't wait to see what Ben comes out with next in his modern knife line, or one-hand opening locking knife line. I'm really excited to see what pattern he translates into this type of knife from his other patterns. So I have loved getting to check out this knife. I think that it's a great knife, and I hope that you've enjoyed the video. If you have, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Also, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, click the bell, and select all so you know when I post new videos. Check out my website, knifethoughts.com, where I post articles on knives like this and knife-related topics. And last but not least, as always, don't forget to go out and do good.